Good evening and welcome to the Cambridge Skeptics live stream. Cambridge Skeptics are a volunteer organisation based in Skeptics, promoting science and critical thinking around Cambridge and across the globe, hopefully. My first time doing the intro, for those that couldn't
Going
tell.
well.
Yes,
Thank you.
You can't tell, don't worry.
This evening, we have a conversation with Dr. Darren Stevens about his constructed development
Theory.
Sorry, I got the feedback from the live stream when it pops up. Yes, his constructed development theory. But first, Andrew has some exciting news.
Oh, God, I wouldn't say exciting. Yes, so we're going to run a little sort of a competition. As we come near to Christmas, we thought it would be nice to give something away. Because we didn't have anything good to give away, we've decided instead to give away a couple of copies of my books. This is my book.
Do they come with the little tabs in them?
If you really want, I can send you one with little tabs.
You have really been going through that book in detail.
Yes. But yeah, book on skepticism and a novel very much not about skepticism. So we're going to be giving a copy of each of those away. All you need to do to enter the competition is be a subscriber on our YouTube channel and put a comment in any of our videos between now and Christmas. So, yep, that's all you need to do. And then we will put all the people's names.
Any sort of comments? Just offensive?
Say, rather than have us trawling through all of our videos, can we say put a comment on this video?
Okay, we'll go with
so
a comment on this
place.
video.
Comment on this video. Or give me a book.
Yeah, or you give me a book, or just anything you like, and your name will be put into a raffle, a draw, whatever they call them. And yes, if you're unlucky enough, you will be sent a copy of both of my books. So there you go. That's our competition.
But just as a note, the Skeptical Toolkit one was so useful. Chris is with us, so you know it's. I know Andrew is being humble, but it's clearly a useful book.
Right.
And
thank you, Sam.
No, that feels good. Thank you, Andrew, and yeah, everyone. Comment if you want to get involved. Darren, Dr. Stevens, how would you prefer to be addressed?
Sir?
Darren's fine.
My lord?
Darren, do you want to introduce us to your work?
Yeah. Bit of background, I teach at university, so the students call me everything from Miss Stevens, literally, to Professor. I answer to everything, unfortunately. My name is Darren Stevens. I've got, if you want me to, I can put a slide on and show you specifically what I'm talking about, because visuals might be easier on the screen for some people. We start to get into the ideas of learning styles. However, learning styles, as skeptics, we should be dubious about learning styles. I'm guessing you guys might have heard of them already, where you have visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and things like this.
Yeah.
Right now.
Yes, I'm a gustatory learner.
Me too. I always for lunch.
Does that mean you eat the information?
I learn through eating, yes. Learn through taste, which limits the amount of stuff I can learn.
Yeah, learning to drive was a killer. But, so basically what I wanted to know was, what is the lowest common denominator between all the psychological theories that we're told about. I mean, we all have a good idea of, you know, we hear the words like introvert and extrovert, and we think we know what they mean. However, if I told you they're not real, they're just labels, and no one can ever tell you specifically how to do introvert. So if I said, Sam, are you an extrovert because you're hosting today? You'd say to me, well, not really. It's just today I'm hosting, and in context, I can be, right?
We were just talking about this before the show. I think before you came on, that like at work, I'm far more extroverted than I am at home because my role at work requires me to be.
Right. So let's keep that in mind, because what I say in my theory is you construct yourself differently. And in the old English is we wear different hats. It's easy, depending on what kind of analogy you want. However, what I say is that at work, you construct yourself this way, and at home, you construct yourself this way. The key is, what are you using to construct yourself with, which we'll go through. And the next bit is it a choice, Sam? Are you constructing your work, Sam, on purpose? And if you're not, I'm sorry to pick on you, by the way, Sam, but if you're not constructing you on purpose, it's a habit. And if it's a habit, it's out of your control, right? So what I wanted to know was, what is the one thing maybe, or two things that unite and separate all of the existing theories that we talk about? And what I found was, just to cut a long story short for everybody, is intention, awareness, choice, and response. When you start adding those 4 pillars of my theory into other things like ocean, you've heard of trait theory, you've heard of psychometrics.
Yep.
When you start asking people, is your trait a choice? They don't know. They don't know that they're introverted in this context or extroverted in that context, and they specifically can't tell you how they do neuroticism. Because if they could, then I could do it the same way, and then I could be neurotic too. But this doesn't just work with ocean or those kinds of traits. It works with a lot of them as well. So there's this thing, a guy called Robert Keegan, another guy called Otto Lasky, and Michael Commons before, and all these other people said, actually, the way we think is in levels. And somebody at this level has a much more complex understanding of the world around them, and probably a much more profound relationship with their own thinking than this person here. However, there's a lot of people who don't like the idea of stages, because 5 is better than 4 is better than 3, and people don't like that. A quick side note, I do a development program called 3 Leaders, and I sold it to some German guys, and I called the stages that come out of my theory, I called the thinking quotient, so I can measure how you think, right? And they said, we don't like that. Why not? I said, because we don't like the idea that someone is better than someone else. And it derived from the war. After the war, they didn't like the idea that this person is better than this person. And they said, well, what about self-awareness? And I said, well, I do the awareness quotient as well, which is another phrase. So we prefer self-awareness, because my self-awareness, the level of my self-awareness, has got nothing to do with you. It's all about me. Yeah. So in Germany, they use the awareness quotient, but everywhere else we can do both. But I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's much more. Yeah, I mean, as a label, it's more intrinsic. There's no judgment cast on someone else for being less aware or more aware. And what it describes to a great extent as well is nuance.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we'll look at it in a minute, what we're doing. But as a skeptical group, if you think about it like this, that trait theory is like the horoscope of psychology.
Yes. Right. Yeah. I think we're all aware. I had my team at work do this as a way of sort of demonstrating the issues with the Myers-Briggs test. Is that everyone did a test. And then we came back 2 months later and everyone did exactly the same test again. And something like 40% of people were different the second time around.
Agreed, 100%. But I would agree, because I've got that slide. And what I think is that because the last time I did it, I came out at INTJ and then INTP. So I wasn't far off. I think that at AQ5 and AQ6, my lower levels, it goes up to 10. I think that INTJ is not available to AQ5s, only because I'm obviously egotistical and arrogant. But but what I'm saying is that if you were to add the levels of development to the Myers-Briggs, the way I've got it here, you'd get something that's 600% more robust as a measure. Because I want to know if at AQ8, the INTJ person is doing INTJ through choice. If it's not through choice and it's just a habit, I suspect they're going to come out lower down. Now, my son is 14 very soon, and he did the Myers-Briggs. And I said, look, before you tell me, I bet you came out INTJ. And he went, no, INTP. And I said, well, I was bloody close. And I said, so what could we infer from that I could guess? And I didn't really guess. I just based on the fact that he's very much like me. So is there any truth? Is there any heritable trait that comes out of Myers-Briggs? Probably not. If we deconstruct it using what I've called the cognitive intentions, we then get a different idea. Now, at the top of this screen, you'll see the seeing, hearing, feeling. However, what these are is shortcuts in our thinking. And I did 3 studies of quantitative, and the last study I had, the first 2 studies were artifactual. There was no data coming out of them. The way to look at it was my data was non-significant. However, in the third study, I had over 8,200 profiles. So the data coming out of that was quite useful. And when you consider the fact that Myers-Briggs has about 16,000 to validate its system, I think 8,000 for one bloke on a PhD wasn't too bad. That kind of thing. So what it tells us is that these shortcuts, now I can ask you this now, because we've already kind of tweaked at Sam being introvert and extrovert when he chooses to be, thus negating the whole introvert extrovert label. But if I said to you, Sam, when you're at work, how do you know you're doing a good job? And you're going to reply in 2 ways. 1, Darren, I just know because I am fairly awesome. Or 2, I like people to tell me. I like feedback in some way, right? And just those 2 extremes. I just know, and I like to be told, is internal perspective and external. And it's basically an external locus of evaluation. And in extremis, an external person would subsume self for the ideas and the perspective of another person. In other words, if you give me feedback and I'm really external and that feedback isn't nice, I might get hurt and offended. So we can predict the way we think and the way we behave based on these. But what's not been done before is, if this is internal and this is external, you don't do external. That limits your capacity to respond in the moment. In the same way that if this is internal and that's external, you're still limited, just in the opposite direction. But it's the limitation, it's the lack of awareness that's key. So understanding how you construct you using these 50 shortcuts in our thinking is key to our self-awareness and is key to our cognitive complexity. And I use these and the idea. Go on.
I know I was going to ask. So is the idea here then that if you can bring someone up to the point where they've got a high level of both internal and external awareness, that they are both then motivated and benchmarking themselves against sort of external success factors, but also have an intrinsic understanding of what makes them good at what they're doing, and therefore can weather bad sort of bad feedback and bad results, because actually they've got faith sort of in their own process and in their.
That's absolutely it. If you're high internal anyway, what you'll do is you'll and if the 3 of you looking at me now are high internal, you'll be judging me and saying, well, what does Darren know? Is he any good at this? Does he know what he's talking about? What's his authority in this? Should I believe it?
Skeptics are all like that.
Well, skeptic is actually, for me, is down here. We measure that specifically, skeptic and trustful. Okay, somebody who is massively trustful like this is gullible and they believe everything you tell them. Okay, you can take them for a ride in a work environment. You'll say, have you done that thing for me? And they'll go, yeah, without checking. There'll be no checks and they'll just believe everything that's said, that kind of thing. Okay, so somebody who is internal will, it's not necessarily the high level that's important. It is balance that we're striving for, Sam. You're absolutely right. However, it's balance around the 45, 50, 55% mark, that kind of thing. Because balance at 80% is still actually low level, because it's an unconscious drive for the 2 of them, let's say internal, external, and you still don't choose, because they're both extreme in essence, rather than at 50%, what they are is considered, it's a considered position at around 50%. And that is a really useful outcome of my research, where balance seems like balance, but it's actually not, because the higher up the balance, the lower level it is.
So is it, sorry, So
Go on.
saying higher up the balance is a low level, is it presumably lower down the balance is as well, if sort of being balanced around the 50-50 mark
Yes.
is sort of what's right. And so on this slide, you know, you've got the AQ8 on the right and the AQ5 on the left. Presumably then that's not the same axis on the right, because on the left it seems to go up to 100%. So that would suggest everyone's quite high up on the right hand side, or is it, am I misunderstanding?
I think you've just seen through my lack of detail. I don't, there's a few things I don't do. One of them is detail. I can walk into the living room and look for something. It's on the sofa and I don't see it. Right. So well done. Perfect. Thank you. And I also don't do procedures very well. So I couldn't follow a recipe to save my life, shall we say. You know, and I could never be an accountant. And this kind of leads us on. I've got other slides. That's, for example, I don't know what you guys do for a living, but if you think about it this way, does the way you think impact your career choice? So did you think this way and it led you to your career? Or do you do the job you do and it's just, you know, exaggerated the way you think? Which way around do you see it?
I mean, I have always been logical, numerate, and did a maths and stats degree at uni, and now do, well, certainly did maths and stats for my day job. Now I run a team doing data science. So there's definitely an element there, but to a great extent, the team leadership wasn't something that I'd aimed for. It was something that happened after loads of people left. And no, it was, but I never sort of expect to be where I was now. But I suppose another part of my nature is that, you know, when things are bad, I can step up, and so and it turned out I was quite good at it.
So what we tend to see is that roles have a level of complexity. Elliot Jacques, Michael Commons, people like this said this. So the higher up the organization you go, I'm bound to have that on another slide, which is behind this one. In the best Blue Peter fashion, I do pretty much have everything covered. I mean, I've got thousands of slides everywhere. So what is CDT? So notice how there's overlap. I start with the same kind of stuff every time. Okay. There's all the list of the main people who do things. Now, just to drop a load of names, I'm friends with Michael Commons, Michael Bachert, Otto Lasky. Otto's not really my friend, but we do talk. That kind of thing.
So your frenemy?
Yeah, kind of, because I kind of shortcutted his system. He's overly academic, okay? Way more so than it needs to be. And by virtue of the fact that I looked at how we construct our thinking using shortcuts, using what are essentially called cognitive heuristics, and demonstrated how we can predict behavior and thinking, blah, blah, blah. He didn't like the fact that I'd shortcutted his system. So it's understandable, really. Young upstart like me, 50 year of age, young upstart. So where was I going with this? I was probably going to, you asked me a question.
Think about jobs. You were talking about different careers that we have and how our thinking affects that.
Thank you. That's perfect. I think it's in the police one. Two people, there it is, it's bloody in front of me. Two people who are using it for their master's degree have same kind of ideas. So that's the question there. How does a profile translate to a career thinking style? So in other words, I asked you, does your thinking come first or does your career come first? Now, my wife was a banker and my wife is very risk averse. If she listened to me, you know, over the years, we'd be millionaires by now, but she doesn't listen. And the question is she a banker because of how she thinks? Or does she think that way because she's a banker? And most people think that because she's risk averse already, she chose a risk averse industry. And I think that's the way it is. So when you look at the differences between, you know, what an accountant looks like in comparison to what a nurse might look like. So you could think about it like this. Somebody who is very external, always wanting to care for other people, is more concerned about the health of others, is what's called second position. In other words, they're in their partner's perspective rather than their own perspective. This kind of thinking style presupposes a nurse career. And I've got the data to map this out. And it's not just nurses, it's psychologists, although I'm a psychologist. Did you know psychologist is not a protected term? Anyone can call themselves a psychologist.
Oh, so
you can't call yourself
a nutritionist.
Thanks.
Well, no, but like in that,
devalue my entire industry.
No, but like anyone can call themselves a nutritionist. There's no certification for being a nutritionist, whereas a dietitian.
No, you
I think it is
a clinical psychologist or a forensic psychologist, nor peculiarly can you call yourself an occupational psychologist, despite them doing all kinds of voodoo and trait theory. Yeah, but the idea is exactly that. What does an entrepreneur's typical profile look like? But just to get you guys interested, what does
is this the whole 25% of CEOs are psychopaths?
Well, what I did was I did the psychopath, and then I said, "What does a police officer look like?"
Okay, well, how
that was okay, actually. That didn't go down too badly. That was all right. So what we've got here, for example, if I need to zoom in on anything, whilst I told you a second ago that a nurse would be really about caring for other people. So when you look at, for example, caring for self, caring for others, the psychopath is pretty much the diametric opposite. They don't care. So they don't care for others. They don't care about other people's perspectives. Absolutely not at all. They're so goal-oriented that they're pretty much reckless. That kind of thing. They're about power and control. It's all about their own position, their own ideas, their own everything. However, that doesn't mean that they can't learn things, because information is about what can I learn here. Very visual people as well, for some reason. I don't know why. I could probably figure that out if we had choice. They are procedural, which also points to the OCD effects of, Dexter and people like that. And relationship and task. For example, if one of your people rang you up, Sam, who works for you, and said, "Sam, my dog died," you might say, "Fine, take it easy, work from home today, don't worry so much." However, if they rang up Dexter, he'd be like, "It's just a dog, come in." Yeah. I'm being nice to you, Sam. You might also say that.
No, I would absolutely let them. We give them a day off.
Yeah, exactly. At least in the morning. At least have them.
So how much variation do you see on these sorts of profiles then within different? So you said you profiled psychopaths, you've profiled police officers. How much is it actually they're all relatively tight and relatively similar, or is it that there's some broad trends, but actually there's quite a lot of variation?
There's quite a lot of variation. And actually, I don't think I've got it on this one. I think I've got it on the other one that I just closed. But I've got, I have profiles of people over time, and I've probably got one here. I see a lot of variation. However, the way they combine demonstrates, well, we can demonstrate that at the lower levels, there are billions of profiles. But at the highest level, AQ10, there are legitimately only about 10, 12 profiles that can exist at AQ10. So it's unlike MBTI in that you've got, which way am I looking? You've got tons at the lower end for obvious reasons, going down to next to nothing at the highest end, which maps to everybody else's levels of development theory. They all say only 5% of people are at the highest levels, whether it's Lervinger, Cook-Greuter, Commons, Lasky, all of these other people. But what's interesting about this is environmental impact. So think about this, right? The last time you guys had to change your thinking at work was because your job changed. Something impacted you in the way your job changed, and that's an environmental change. So if we map that out, you can see the dates when the profiles were done at the bottom. So this person was flying high around 2010. 7.6 is actually quite a really good score on my AQ system, right? Then a few years later, this person, she gets divorced. Well, divorce is an environment. And in essence, it's potentially an emotional trauma, if you really want to think about it like that. Well, how does that impact your thinking? Well, we can specifically map how it impacts your thinking. Please ignore the names, but we can map it using those cognitive intentions. And the overall score comes out lower because she's not thinking in the same way when the environment was more pleasing. Now, obviously, a few years later, she's probably got rid of the bum and her thinking's gone back up. Now, there's a lot of talk about resilience at the moment. This is resilience. She's bounced back and she's even marginally higher. That there for me is a measurable resilience. And then a couple of years later, I think maybe it's time to do another one with her, but a couple of years later, the management changed in her business and she didn't like the change. Management is an environment. Your work is your environment. Your thinking changes. And we can map the change in thinking. I've got another one by a German guy who broke his leg and he couldn't go skiing, and that really impacted him.
Imagine how, imagine that actually doing a load of these tests post or during pandemic would probably show a lot of people having been under a lot of stress for sort of a long period of time, sort of suffering.
Did you guys work from home? Have you worked from home over the time, over the pandemic?
Unfortunately, so.
Yeah, my wife loves it. She loves working from home.
Yeah, we've just obviously with everything that's been going on, but our office has just been going to be under renovation for the next number of months, and so we were going in a couple of days a week, sort of balance it out. But now it's just working from home, and it's only been a couple of days, and I hate it already. So.
I don't mind. I don't mind teaching. I don't like online teaching, I have to say, because I'm old. I treat my classroom like a 2-hour stand-up show, quite literally, and I much prefer it in the class. So I'm very used to this, but it's not my preference. You know what I mean?
So, sorry. So someone brought up a question in the chat, and they've said, so it's come from Camilla. And she said, I think this classifying people is a bit circular. You name a quality and then classify it by the, name a quality and then classify it by the qualities that you think they are. So is there an element of circularity in this, or is it, are the results leading, as you said earlier, about talking about people going to occupations that suit their results?
What Camilla is talking about is something called psychometric isomorphism. I do apologize, Camilla. I am an academic. Psychometric isomorphism. And what you're saying is, what you're asking essentially is, when you do a psychometric test, there's a question that says, I feel blue, right? And you need to know whether that means you're cold or you're sad or you're dating a Smurf, right? I'm glad we're all old enough to get that reference. And what the idea is that by virtue of the fact that you say I feel sad, you've got 7 different tests, all using exactly the same words, that then map that word, I feel blue, that sentence, to 7 different outcomes, calmness, agreeableness, that kind of thing. And what psychometrics suffer from is the meaning making and the sense making behind the actual question set. What we do with my question set is when I say someone is, let me just go back to this. When I say someone is a nurse, they've done a profile that looks exactly like that, right? They've done a profile called the identity compass. It takes them half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. And the results come out looking exactly like that. So they've told me how they construct their thinking, indirectly and hopefully unconsciously. But it's not me making anything up. It's not me saying it. They've told me, and I'm just relaying it back. Where it gets interesting is the balance, the levels that they don't know about. So when you look at interventions, for example, somebody who is massively internal and or even massively external, it doesn't really matter. How do you do the interventions to say, well, we need to work on this? We need to get somebody to think in the opposite direction. Well, we've got interventions. It just so happens I've got a slide on it. They've said they're internal, right? Well, what does internal mean? How do you do your intervention? And it's all here. So for the top, let's say it's the top 13 cognitive intentions, the top 13 shortcuts. I can influence your thinking and behavior. But if you think about it like this, right? If you say to me, I'm very, very external, I prefer other people's opinions of me. If I get feedback and it's negative, I get hurt. External. If I give you an internal intervention that you do for a couple of months, at my age, it might take 2 months or so to get it and to get the balance. If you're younger, it'll probably take you 2 weeks. You know, it's just the way our brains age. Once you get balance, you've got choice, and that choice changes your external behavior. So that changes your worldview. So it might seem like it's a simple thing not to care what other people think, but the behavioral and thinking ramifications of that change in your, just that one change out of 50 in your thinking impacts your worldview. And I've seen it quite a few times now, probably about 400 times. So I understand the question, Camilla, but it's, luckily for me, the client or whomever tells me how they think rather than me imposing my thoughts on them. I hope that makes sense.
So it sounds like from the classification point of view or giving people ratings, it's descriptive rather than prescriptive.
The questions are very useful in the sense that they ask you in a way that hints at internal, external, where I said to you, how do you know you're doing a good job? Well, that question might actually be in the system. However, it's also in there about 5 other ways in different styles. There's only so much you can do from a self-report question set. I do have other question sets, but they're not finished yet, and they are a bit more difficult. And I won't go into it now, but they ask questions like, how does your thinking today relate to your thinking 10 years ago? And that's actually a bit more dialectical, a bit more difficult than it sounds like. How does your thinking relate to your thinking? Not how is it different? It's a different kind of question set. But that's kind of towards Lasky's, he calls them thought form questions, and they're awful until you get your head around them. But what I did in my research, this is called a factor analysis, which I'm sure, Sam, you're aware of, that kind of thing, if you do stats and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, you know probably a lot more about it than I do. There's a guy called Piaget who looked at stages first, and he looked at kids' development, and obviously there's guys like Vygotsky and Bruno and all these, Wordsworth and all these other guys. But what they talked about was, we don't really grow unless we have a disruption in our thinking. And they called it disequilibrium. Okay, now think about that, right? The last time your job changed and forced you to think in a different way, that was a disruption in your environment. Okay, just like this person who got divorced, where their thinking went right down, that was a disruption. What my data shows is, if I could find it again, is that the opposites over here, difference, sameness and difference, polar and consensus, is that in the first factor on the left-hand side, they're the ones that we do the most. They're the ones that we've got the easiest access to according to the data. But what's interesting is on dimension 3, the opposites are there. So in other words, let's pick one. If you do polar too much, and polar is somebody who's really polar will kick the pram just to hear the baby cry. You'll say, it's the sky's blue, never know, it's not, it's grey, that kind of thing. They're just always looking for the opposite. Yeah.
So within the ocean model, that would be someone had low agreeableness.
If you like, yeah, absolutely, right?
Yeah, as a translation, yeah.
So that kind of polar thinking, if you want to develop their thinking in a vertical direction to get them to think, you do the opposite, which is the disequilibrium. And this actual slide maps to Piaget's disequilibrium and a couple of other people's. And I didn't know this was going to come out of the data. It was fantastic when it did, and I didn't know it. But what is interesting is I initially mapped it all to Keegan and Lasky's systems. So Keegan's and Lasky's level 2 is all about me. Level 3 is all about other. 4 is all about me again. However, this is from a position of more, it's called self-authored thinking. It's more from a position of choice and understanding. And then level 5 is again about other. However, it's for the greater good and the global picture and all that kind of stuff. But what's interesting is, if in the data, in dimension 4, it's all about self, own, individualist, internal, right? In dimension 5, it's all about the other person. And I didn't know this was going to come out of the data as well. If I did, that would have been fantastic, but I'm just not that clever. So the way this came out of the data was, if you do these cognitive intentions too much, you're probably emotionally scarred and need therapy. If you do these too much, you're getting towards Dexter territory. Right? So again, I'm speaking in extremes, obviously. What you need is balance. You need the equilibrium. If you don't have it, you've got the disequilibrium. And it all mapped to exist in psychology. And that was fantastic for me, because it obviously gave a deeper, a more profound foundation to the theory that says, actually, unintentionally, I've mapped it to Piaget's stages, Keegan's stages, Lasky's stages, that kind of thing. And it works a treat in that sense. I'll be quiet now. By the way, I can talk forever, so please jump in.
So you're talking about a question, you're talking about balance there. So I get the idea that what you think people should be aiming for is sort of balance across the board. The more balanced you are, the higher up you are on your thinking quota thing. So your 10 at the top is going to be someone who's incredibly balanced. It does make me wonder, are there any traits that you came across where one side of the thing is, I guess, arguably better? Are there any places where it doesn't work, where being unbalanced is actually more helpful or something? Is that a good question? I don't know.
Think about it from a leadership perspective. Now, luckily, I just changed that to the word leader rather than police officer. But what we're looking at, for example, is if you want a leader who's at choice, and the reason I picked that one a second ago was because this is really what it boils down to. What's your intention in the moment? How aware are you of your intention right now as we're sitting here, right? How aware are you of your intention? How much choice does that awareness create for you? And can you respond in the moment differently to what you might have responded to, in another scenario? So for me, this is the key. And is there a point where imbalance is preferred? You want a leader. Have you guys heard of the term servant leader?
Yes, Eric and I talk about it constantly. Well, not constantly, but have talked about it several times, because we both ascribe to it that you lead by serving the people under you to a great extent.
I hate it. I've got a slide on it.
Really? Go for it.
And the reason I hate it is because it was written by somebody who clearly has never heard of levels of adult development. In fact, if you guys bear with me for 2 seconds, I actually have my servant leader. I will show you, because it'll explain it nicely. Well, it won't explain it nicely, but it'll explain it. So what is the issue with servant leader? Well, the issue is this, right? There are 8 characteristics of servant leader, and they're all this. Please don't read it. I will go through it, right? In normal text, that's what it looks like. Same slide, text. The next slide is a bunch of red text, which means I've got a problem with it, right? That's the normal servant leader. They're the ones I have a problem with. Why? And it's not just because I think I'm right. It's not about that. It's about levels of development. Showing one's true identity, intentions, and motivations. People don't know their intentions. People don't know their true identity. People don't know what their motivations are. We think we do. Every single bit of data, research shows that we don't. Not just my own. I did a number of tests on self-awareness, obviously, because that's the PhD. We don't know that we're not self-aware. And I'm not talking about necessarily the Dunning-Kruger effect. You know what that is, you guys?
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily saying that stupid people don't know they're stupid, because on my scale, a person at AQ5 knows they're AQ5. What they don't know is how to get out of it. Okay, and that's it. So I've got a grid that I use with clients, and if they say something a lot, I will get them to point on the grid to where it is, and they are more than happy to tell me when the thing they're thinking is low level, because awareness is key. Once you're aware, you start to develop choices. And that's all the theory is: intention, awareness, choice, response. But from a servant leader perspective, oh my God, these are all of them. Having high self-awareness of one's strengths and developmental needs. You don't know what your developmental needs are. It's that simple. I don't know what my developmental needs are, and I've got a PhD in it. Yeah. Now we think we do, because Sam's looking at me going, "Yeah, I do, Darren. I do. I know it."
Oh, no. I would say I probably sit more into the first point, which is there are certainly things I know I need to develop on. Exactly. Agreed. How to do them, how to do that, how to be better. That's the thing that's difficult. But I am also aware there are things I must be unaware of.
So what we think is, and I far be it from me to quote Captain Jack Sparrow, but the problem isn't the problem. The problem is how you think about the problem. Okay? Because that's how it is. Coaching 2.0, which is my new system, focuses on how we construct ourselves. I don't actually care what problem you come to me with, because the problem you have is constructed at your level. And if your level is here after you've done my profile, we can get you to here. By the time you get to here in your thinking, using my system, using the interventions that we've talked about, the problem changes, and the problem might not even be a problem. However, if we go back to the internal external question and focusing on others more than yourself, where's the balance? Is it a choice? Can you choose not to focus on others? So when you look at it from a leadership perspective, you ask me, is it better to have maybe, one of them out of balance? Yeah, I think a leader should be more internal than external. Why? Because they need to tell their subordinates to bugger off when the time comes. Because they're the ones who, they're the ones who take the rap if it all goes wrong. And they can't, well, it wasn't me, it was my secretary that made me do it. They're not going to do that. They're not going to get away with that. And focusing on others more than self is not balanced. This is a terrible suggestion, unless the individual has a capacity to choose not to. That's it. Does that make sense? So we can go through the whole things like behaving ethically. Ethics don't exist. They're nice to have. They're a label that are not real. Morality and ethics, it's a level 3 trait when you look at it from a Keegan perspective, which is a socialized mind. We have these agreed social ethics that we all adhere to, allegedly. However, you go to other countries.
Yeah.
Go on, Sam.
I was going to say that's a very deontological point of view, that actually, ethics comes simply from the rules that we all agree, rather than necessarily utilitarianism or something else.
Well, exactly. And I was just about to say that if you go to other countries, they throw gays off buildings because they don't think it's moral. So, I'm going to use massive generalization. Everybody does it, that kind of thing. So from an ethical perspective, I think that it's more innate, but whose ethics are we going to use in an organization from a leadership perspective? Because I used to work for a company where the boss was forcing words like integrity and ethics on the entire organization. It was a large multinational organization. And all the time he was forcing integrity on his employees. He was banging his secretary in the company jet. So, and what that tells us is that at the higher levels of Lasky's system, they rely on other people to keep them honest. Ethics don't exist. Rules are for other people. And you see it today in government, our current government. We'll tell everybody what to do, but they don't apply to us. No, it's not applying to us. So go on, Sam, have you got a thought?
Well, I mean, there were two thoughts that came to mind. One of them is that I've always hated the idea of company values,
yeah.
And came across a great quote years ago, which I'm going to misquote, but that values, company values, company ethics, essentially are not the words that you have on the floor of your atrium. It's the behaviors that you reward and the people that you promote.
Right. So what I tell my students is, why do corporations have ethics and things like this? It's because they want you to behave in such a way as the company doesn't get sued. So, which is a cynical approach, I know, isn't it, Andrew? It's very cynical, but that's it, isn't it? If you conform to this set of ethical codes, we won't get sued for your dodgy behavior. What else were you saying, Sam?
That's not. You're not wrong there. per se. But at the same time, like there are ethical people at the high levels of companies. It's not.
Of course, I'm not generalizing. Only a few of them. I mean, well, you said earlier that like 35% of CEOs are sociopaths. So at least 35%. Yeah.
Well, I was quoting that it's commonly held. I don't know if that's actually the number, but it's
There are a lot of studies on it, and when some of the studies, just a simple study on sandwiches. Somebody comes in and brings sandwiches to a floor, a level. Have you heard of these ones? And it's all it says is, you don't have to pay for these sandwiches; they're free. However, you feel free to leave a donation. And it's the people at the lower levels of the organisation that leave donations, and the CEO just takes them because he's entitled to it because he's worked his way up to blah blah blah. And there's a lot of stuff like that. There's a lot of research about that. But the idea of all of this literally boils down to, can you choose not to do it? Are you sufficiently aware of your actions in the moment that you can choose either to do it or not to do it? That's all it boils down to. And if you can, you might be high level. If you can't, you might be lower level. But neither. Go on.
I was just going to ask how this overlaps then with things like mindfulness or NLP in terms of being aware of what's happening and trying to be sort of deliberate and modify your own behavior very sort of consciously.
Well, NLP, if you look at NLP on my scale, NLP master practitioner will take you up to about here, AQ 6, maybe about there. To get to the higher levels requires usually beyond the NLP scale. And I know I've got NLP qualifications, if you can call them qualifications. I've got those as well. And I've given talks at the NLP conference in London, not recently because of COVID, but the last one that was, I gave a talk about this research, because what we get out of this, what you see here, is a more ethical framework for coaching, which is what coaching 2.0 is, and that's what comes out of it. It basically says that if you've got a coach down here, they can't coach the higher levels because they can't see their patterns. They can't see what you can see. So how can they coach you? And then what you do is they fall back on the first, second, third generation process-driven coaching. That's not how it is. When you look at it from a developmental perspective, you will get basically horizontal coping strategies, horizontal development, rather than vertical development. And that's another 2-hour talk.
I suppose that makes sense in terms of pretty much anything. If you want to get better at something, you don't get someone who's on a lower level than you to help you improve. You find someone who is better at that thing. And so if you're looking to improve your thinking or your awareness, you find someone who has clearer patterns of thinking and awareness to help you with that. Yeah,
absolutely. I train in martial art. You can see my wooden dummy over there. If I want to get better at my martial art, I get someone who beats me up. I don't train with a beginner, even though beginners are unpredictable. Do you play squash? If I play squash, well, not at the moment, but if I want to get better at squash, I play somebody who can control the tee and kick my butt all over the squash court. I don't play a beginner. It's exactly the same thing. You go to someone, the client is AQ 6, the coach is AQ 8, because let's put it this way, the client sees this, but the coach sees that. They see the gap that the client doesn't see. And I've put it there in the gap. It was in red previously, but it's the dynamic intelligence gap. That's all it is. And that's a much more ethical approach. And what's coming out of this is something called the Constructive Development Institute. If you guys have heard of things like the International Coaching Federation or Association for Coaches, things like that, anybody can go to those and do the whole weekend course and come out and call yourselves a coach. If you did that on mine and you came out at, say, AQ 5, you still couldn't be a coach because you can't coach the AQ 6 and above, blah, blah, blah. It makes sense, doesn't it? You get the idea. And to go back to like Camilla's point, even though they're telling us what their thinking structure is, when they come out like this and we pretend that's AQ 5, we can change it to look like this And we know specifically that means their thinking goes up to AQ6. And that's this is called stage transition. And when you look at Lerving and all these other people, they invoke all kinds of clever names like bridges and shells, but no one can tell you specifically how to think differently in order to go up a level. My system does that, and the profile system does allow that. And I like that. So to your point, that is that kind of thing there. So the red means no, and green means yes. And that there is the whole essence of a more ethical framework. And I've called this one here Destination 7, because I think everybody could get to 7 with sufficient intention, awareness, choice, response. You might already be at 8, Sam, I don't know, but that's everybody else is 7. So that's the idea. A friend of mine who uses my framework in his business, he uses my coaching 2.0 framework in his coaching business. He created this slide, and I really like it because I really hate it because it's better than mine, but I really like it because it tells you precisely the AQ, the 5 coach cannot coach the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 client. But this guy here, which I've called a more complex other, MCO. Have you guys heard of Vygotsky's more knowledgeable other when you did the zone of proximal development? If I'm talking nonsense, tell me to stop. I adapted Vygotsky to adults because that's about children. And I called it the zone of dynamic development, because you and I don't need somebody with more knowledge. We need somebody who's more complex in their thinking to point out where our thinking isn't quite so complex. So they can see our patterns and say, hang on a second, Darren, this is what you're doing. So I've called it a more complex other. And that might also then go to the same thing we said earlier about 5 is better than 4 is better than 3. However, if we abbreviate that to MCO, it masks it a little bit. What do we like for time? Because I don't know how long this goes on.
We're coming up towards the end. We usually go for about an hour, so we've got about just under 10 minutes left. So I guess a question that springs to me is that are there any tips you can give us? Are there any ideas you can leave us with and the people watching with of how we can improve our thinking, how we can raise ourselves up a bit?
Yeah, there is. I just wanted to ask you this one thing. Do you think culture is important? Do you think culture impacts your thinking? Do you think you construct yourself differently if you speak other languages and go and do a profile in the other language?
Yeah, I think people would be.
Yeah, if nothing else, something that I've personally observed is a member of my team who when we hired her had only been speaking English for about 15 months, and was incredibly quiet when she first started, because to a great extent she wasn't comfortable talking. To a great extent she wasn't confident. And then over the 6 years now that I've worked with her, she's become more and more relaxed and more confident, and become more and more, from I understand it, what her sort of a natural sense is when she's speaking Persian, because she's Iranian. And so she absolutely, she is very visibly changed in her personality over the time that I've known her, or at least the personality that she's sort of put across. But I imagine that even today, she's still more gregarious in Persian than she is in English.
Absolutely. And what we find, this one's got English Indonesian, but there is I've got another profile where a guy who considers himself German and Spanish. And his profiles in German and Spanish conform to the stereotypes that we have as English people for Germans and Spaniards. In Spanish, he's much more relaxed about time, he's just much more relaxed, full stop, Mediterranean lifestyle. But in German, his profile is much more procedural, is much more efficient, that kind of, and it comes out in the profiles. So what I ask my students is, and I ask of all of them, can you, because they're coming to London, for example, can you step out of your culture to the point where it doesn't impact your thinking? And predominantly they say no.
Isn't that a bit like trying not to have an accent?
No. How does I don't even know what the English culture is and how it impacts me. I'd have to go somewhere else for a long time to figure out what my English culture is. However, if you come from Indonesia and you come and live in London for a little while, everything about your Indonesian culture comes with you. Can you leave it at the door? Can you step out of it and absorb, the Londonness of everything, so that Indonesian doesn't impact your construction of you? And it's really bloody hard. We are massively impacted. This is social constructionism, obviously, but what we've got here is what I boast about in my thesis is that this is my theory is the conduit, the bridge between constructivism, individual, and constructionism, environment. And this kind of demonstrates that. Now, you said, one of you asked, what can we do about this? Is there something that we can do to, yes, just stop. In the moment, stop and think, how does this impact me? How does this affect me? Whatever it is, I don't care what it is you're doing. Just stop and say, is this good for me? Especially if you know you put other people before yourself. If you know that you favor others' opinions, if you know that you cater to other people's needs before your own, just stop and say, do I want to do this? Is it good for me? And you'd be surprised that just doing that 10 times a week, 20 times a month will change your outlook, because it will raise your awareness of how you are. If you are massively internal, for example, you can do, I will happily share slides with whoever wants them or whatever. Write down, you could consider a time 250 years in the future, a distant descendant, curious about you, searches for the family history, write down what they would say about you, who you are, what you did, that kind of thing. And if somebody who's really internal does that, it externalizes their locus of evaluation. And there are ways, that kind of thing. That makes sense. So there's all kinds of things we can do. I call them interventions.
Okay, well, that was really interesting. That was giving me a lot to think about personally. Before we wrap up, has anybody else got any questions in the comments? Doesn't look like there's any right now, but there is a bit of a delay between. So we'll just give people a chance to ask. Is there any other little bits you'd like to leave us with, Darren, before we end the show?
5 is not better than 4 is not better than 3. When you look at my system here, all it tells me is that if you do my profile and you come out at AQ8, it tells me you have more choice in your thinking and acting. That's it, right? The person at 5 doesn't have quite as much choice as you, but they still have choices. So it's not about better or worse. It's just about a different construction of self and a different level of awareness of your construction. And everybody, I reckon everybody could get up to 7. And that fills me with hope, shall we say.
Actually, within that, is there an element of awareness versus capability? So you might have someone who's got relatively low awareness of themselves and of how they interact, but is then deeply capable within it, and maybe someone else who is excruciatingly aware of the things they're good at and the things they're bad at, but not able to change things. Or is there an inherent self-mastery within the?
Yeah, I think there is an inherent. I think by the time you get up to AQ8 and AQ9, for example, at AQ9, personality is a choice. Personality isn't real. It doesn't exist. We construct ourselves today the way we did yesterday because we're inherently lazy and it's just too much effort to try and construct ourselves differently. However, you're under no obligation to be the same person you were 5 minutes ago. But you've got to get up to like AQ9 in order to choose how you construct you in the moment. And at AQ10, which no one is, it's just a nice to have, you construct your environment. And Korzybski said, the map is not the territory. But at AQ10, you're constructing the map and the territory to fit you, not the other way around. Whereas at 5, they're unconsciously barreling through life, doing whatever they want to do, with a lack of awareness. But at AQ8 and 9, maybe there's some consideration in their actions, they're thinking, that kind of thing. Did I answer that then?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question just coming off of what you just said, and maybe it's not a thing that actually applies, but yes, a person at 9 might have more choices, but you said about a person at 5 is barreling through life just doing things. Are they happier? Is a person at 9 going to be happier than a person at 5?
Or is it an ignorance is bliss?
Yeah. Is it? Yeah.
I get asked that a lot, and the answer is that AQ9 and whatnot, happiness is a construct. It doesn't exist. They're neither happy nor unhappy because they know both are constructed.
So that then raises for me the question of, is that a good thing? If I'm just going, well, you know, I've had a lovely day today, but the happiness I felt was just a construct. Does that take away from it?
You had a good day. The good is the construct there.
Okay, yeah, sorry, bad choice.
but this is the point. You know, at the higher levels of Buddhism, the Bodhisattva knows that this too shall soon pass. So they have no assumptions about whether this is good or bad, and whether it is good or bad, depending on somebody else's perspective, it doesn't last long anyway. But at AQ9, for me, how you construct you in the moment, you know, happiness in that sense is a choice.
Okay, I get you. So it's not, so you actually can go, whatever's happening, I can choose to be happy. So in that case, an AQ9 would be potentially a happier person than the ignorance is bliss type person at 5.
Or is it more about, actually they can be miserable, but that's not going to let them, they're not going to let that affect, you know, once their whatever's happening happens, it doesn't affect the rest of their day, and they can manage themselves through it.
Because they might ask themselves, well, how am I constructing this misery? What am I not seeing that's just as important? Which is a great question. I do love that question. My wife hates it when I tell her to construct a better mood. Try it, guys. See what happens.
I'm making the choice not to.
So, I mean, I'm happy to carry on. It's just
I think that's actually a really good point to wrap up on. It's 8 o'clock. We usually like to try and go for about an hour. So Camilla's made a comment that the AQ9 sounds very Spock-like, but
I've seen that as well. Exactly.
Yeah. But yes, so thank you very much, Darren, for coming and talking about that. That was really given me a lot to think about personally. I think it's really interesting. It's been really good sort of talking with you, and also chatting in WhatsApp beforehand. I've enjoyed engaging with you in the lead up to this.
I would be happy to do it again if you guys come back as skeptics and tell me where I'm wrong. I have no problem with that.
I'll have a think about it. So I don't think this is going to be the last show of the year. The next one would be very close to Christmas, and with, you know, people's Christmas plans, there's probably not going to work out. Of course, the government are likely to cancel all of those, so, you know, but we will be back in the new year. We are hoping to get more guests in the new year. Depending on what restrictions go on, we may even get back into a physical environment, back in the pub, but we shall see. So does anybody else have anything to say, or should we just round things off and bring things to a close? Nope. Okay.
Happy holidays.
Yes, happy holidays. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you again, Darren, and we will see you all in the new year.